My daughter-in-law packed her bags for an urgent business trip and walked out the door. The, the lock clicked. My son, who had not taken a single step in 8 years, pushed himself out of his wheelchair, walked right into the middle of the kitchen, and looked me dead in the eye. "We need to go," he said. "Now." I grabbed my keys and followed him. What we uncovered that afternoon destroyed my daughter-in-law's perfect life forever. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to outsmart someone who thought you were just a foolish old man. My name is Bruce. I am 73 years old, and for the last 2 years, I have been a ghost in my own house. I spent 40 years working as a corporate forensic auditor, a job that required a sharp mind and an eye for the smallest discrepancies. But to my daughter-in-law, Monica, I was nothing more than a live-in maid and a convenient bank account. It was a typical Tuesday morning, and my knees ached as I knelt on the kitchen floor, scrubbing a coffee stain from the linoleum. The house we lived in was spacious and located in a quiet, affluent suburb, a home we pooled our resources to buy after my son Jared was in a devastating car accident 8 years ago. The crash had supposedly paralyzed Jared from the waist down. Now, at 38 years old, my once vibrant and athletic son spent his days confined to his wheelchair, staring blankly out the living room window. I heard the sharp clicking of heels on the hardwood floor. Monica walked into the kitchen, dressed in an immaculate tailored suit, smelling of expensive perfume. She did not even look down as she stepped right over my wet sponge, her high heel nearly clipping my fingers. She walked straight to the microwave to check her reflection, adjusting her gold earrings. To the outside world, Monica was a saint. Her friends and colleagues constantly praised her for staying with her paralyzed husband, calling her a devoted, suffering caregiver who carried the weight of the world on her shoulders. But behind closed doors, she was a tyrant. She treated me with a casual, daily cruelty, speaking to me only when she needed something cleaned or paid for. I absorbed the disrespect in silence, enduring the daily humiliations simply because I needed to be near my son. I painfully pulled myself up from the floor and went to the counter to pour a cup of coffee. Monica turned around and slid a piece of paper across the granite island. It was a medical bill. "Bruce, I need $1,500 today," she said, her tone flat and expectant. I looked at the piece of paper. "I need to cover Jared's specialized physical therapy copays," she added, casually checking her phone. I felt a knot form in my stomach. Jared had not seen a physical therapist in months. He rarely left the house unless it was for a mandatory doctor appointment. I looked at Monica, trying to find a polite way to push back. "Monica, my pension check just cleared yesterday," I said softly. "If I give you $1,500 right now, I will barely have enough to cover my own medications and groceries for the rest of the month." She slowly lowered her phone and looked at me. The mask of the beautiful, professional woman slipped, revealing the cold, calculating eyes beneath. "Well, Bruce," she said, her voice dropping to a terrifying, icy whisper, "if you cannot contribute to your own son's medical care, I suppose I will have to look into that state-funded facility in Oregon. It is far away, and the conditions are not great, but it is all I can afford without your help." My breath caught in my throat. Oregon was thousands of miles away. It was a blatant threat. She knew that my entire world revolved around Jared. The thought of my paralyzed son, sitting alone in a sterile, underfunded facility across the country, was more than I could bear. She was holding my access to my own child hostage. I swallowed my pride, feeling the familiar bitter taste of defeat. I walked over to the drawer, pulled out my checkbook, and wrote the check with a trembling hand. I handed it to her. She snatched it from my fingers without a word of thanks, slipping it into her designer handbag. Her victory was absolute. "I have a flight to catch," she announced, pouring her coffee into a travel mug. "I am leading a major consulting retreat in Chicago. I will be gone until Sunday night." She reached into her bag and pulled out a long typed document, dropping it onto the kitchen island. "These are Jared's care instructions," she said, speaking to me as if I were a slow child. Make sure you turn him every 2 hours. Do not mess up his medication schedule like you did last time. You are getting forgetful, Bruce. Try to keep your wits about you this weekend. I do not want to come home to a disaster." She did not wait for a response. She walked into the living room where Jared sat silently in his wheelchair. She patted him on the head like he was a family pet. "Bye, honey," she said breezily. "Be good for your father." Jared did not respond. He just kept staring out the window. Monica rolled her expensive suitcase out the front door. The heavy oak door slammed shut. A second, I heard the sharp click of the deadbolt locking from the outside. Then I heard the engine of her luxury SUV start up and fade away down the street. The house fell into a suffocating, heavy silence. I stood in the kitchen holding a wet sponge looking at the typed list of demands she had left for me. I felt utterly useless, a tired old man trapped in a prison of his own making. I took a deep breath and prepared to walk into the living room to start the grueling physical process of hoisting my son from his wheelchair to the couch. But before I could take a single step, the silence of the house was broken. I heard the unmistakable sound of heavy, deliberate footsteps coming from the living room. The silence left in Monica's wake was suffocating. I stood perfectly still by the kitchen island, staring at the empty space where she had just been. The faint scent of her floral perfume still lingered in the air, clashing with the harsh chemical smell of the floor cleaner I had been using moments before. I closed my eyes and took a slow, deep breath, trying to steady the frantic beating of my heart. My hands were still trembling slightly from the confrontation over the check. Every time she left the house, the atmosphere shifted. The oppressive weight of her constant judgment vanished, leaving behind a hollow, quiet emptiness. But there was no time to rest. The reality of my daily responsibilities loomed ahead. I rolled my shoulders, wincing, as a familiar, sharp ache shot down my lower back. I was 73 years old, and my body reminded me of that fact every single day. Taking care of a fully grown paralyzed adult man was a task designed for a team of trained nurses, not an aging father with arthritis. But I did it because Jared was my son. I loved him more than life itself, and I would gladly break my own back 1,000 times over to make his life even a fraction of an ounce easier. I rubbed my temples mentally, walking myself through the grueling physical mechanics of the transfer process. I needed to move him from his wheelchair to the living room couch. It required precision leverage and all the physical strength I could muster. I pictured the sequence in my mind. First, I would have to lock the wheels of his chair. Then I would position the wooden transfer board between the chair and the couch cushions. I would wrap my arms around his chest, lock my hands behind his back, brace my knees against his useless legs, and hoist his dead weight upward and across. It was a humiliating, exhausting routine for both of us. Jared hated being carried like a helpless infant, and I hated that I could barely manage his weight anymore. Every day I lived with the terrifying fear that my knees would buckle, that I would drop him, and that I would end up injuring the only family I had left. I opened my eyes, grabbed a clean towel to dry my wet hands, and tossed it onto the counter. I braced myself for the physical toll, taking one last deep breath before turning toward the living room. I expected to hear the familiar rhythmic squeak of rubber tires on the hardwood floor as Jared wheeled himself closer to the archway. That was the sound that had defined our lives for the past 8 years, a constant mechanical reminder of the tragedy that had stolen my son's independence. But that is not what I heard. Instead, a completely different sound cut through the silence of the house. It was a heavy, solid thud. Then another, and another. The sound echoed off the high ceiling of the hallway. It was the distinct rhythmic noise of a grown man walking in heavy boots across the wooden floorboards. My heart stopped dead in my chest. A cold, electric wave of sheer panic washed over me. Someone was in the house. The deadbolt had clicked shut just minutes ago, but someone else was walking right down our hallway. My mind raced, jumping to the most terrifying conclusions. A home invasion. A burglar. Someone who had watched Monica leave and knew that only a crippled man and an old man were left inside. I spun around, my eyes scanning the kitchen for anything I could use to defend us. A heavy cast iron skillet. A carving knife. My hands felt clumsy and numb. The footsteps were getting closer, growing louder, and more deliberate with every passing second. They did not sound stealthy or cautious. They sounded authoritative. They sounded like a man with a purpose. I grabbed the edge of the kitchen island, forcing my tired legs to hold me upright. I stared at the wide archway that connected the kitchen to the living room, my breath trapped in my throat. I prepared myself to scream, to fight, to throw myself in front of whatever intruder was about to walk around that corner to protect my helpless son sitting in his wheelchair just a few feet away. The footsteps reached the edge of the archway. A shadow fell across the floor. A tall figure stepped into the bright morning light of the kitchen. The breath was knocked completely out of my lungs. I let go of the counter and staggered backward, my legs suddenly turning to water. I hit the edge of the refrigerator, my hands flying up to cover my mouth. A strangled, choking sound escaped my throat. My mind fractured into a million pieces, completely unable to process the impossible image standing right in front of me. It was Jared, my son, who had supposedly severed his spinal cord 8 years ago. My son, whose legs I had washed and moved and massaged every single day because he could not feel them. My son was standing in the middle of the kitchen. He was not leaning against the wall. He was not using a cane or a walker. He was standing completely upright, his weight evenly distributed on both feet, looking taller and more imposing than I had remembered. For a fleeting, chaotic second, I thought I was having a stroke. I thought my old mind had finally snapped under the immense pressure of stress and exhaustion. I waited to wake up to snap out of the hallucination. But the image did not fade. The floorboards creaked under his weight. He was real. He was there. I expected to see joy. I expected to see tears of absolute disbelief running down his face. I expected the joyous, triumphant miracle of a man who had suddenly been freed from an 8-year prison of paralysis. But there was no celebration on Jared's face. There was no relief. His jaw was clenched so tightly that a muscle twitched in his cheek. His shoulders were rigid, pulled back in a posture of pure, coiled tension. And his eyes were terrifying. They were burning with a dark, cold, and intensely focused rage. It was a look of pure, calculated fury directed at something far beyond the walls of this kitchen. He looked like a soldier preparing to step onto a battlefield. I could not speak. The silence stretched between us, thick and heavy. I trembled violently, completely paralyzed by a mixture of shock, confusion, and overwhelming fear. I wanted to run to him, to hug him, to fall on my knees and thank whatever higher power had granted this impossible miracle. But the terrifying intensity in his eyes kept me frozen in place against the refrigerator door. Jared took one more step toward me. His heavy boots thudded against the linoleum. He did not smile. He did not cry. He looked at my terrified, trembling face, his expression completely devoid of any emotion other than absolute resolve. "We need to go," he said, his voice low, steady, and dangerously calm. "Now." I did not ask questions. The sheer gravity in my son's voice broke through my paralysis. I moved on pure instinct, grabbing my car keys from the hook by the door. Jared walked past me, his steps heavy but sure, and headed straight for the garage. I watched his broad shoulders, his steady gait. My mind struggling to process the impossible truth playing out in front of my eyes. He opened the passenger door of my sedan, slid into the seat, and stared straight ahead. I got behind the wheel, my hands gripping the leather so tightly my knuckles turned white. I started the engine, threw the car into reverse, and backed out of the driveway. As we sped away from the house, the silence in the car was deafening. I glanced at his legs, the same legs I had massaged and positioned for years, the legs I had painstakingly hoisted into a wheelchair every single morning. "How is this possible?" I finally whispered, my voice trembling. "How long?" Jared did not look at me. He kept his eyes locked on the road ahead. 2 years, Dad. I have been unable to walk for 2 years. The words hit me like a physical blow. I slammed on the brakes as we reached the end of our subdivision, staring at him in absolute disbelief. 2 years. My mind spun, calculating the hundreds of days, the thousands of hours I had spent tending to a paralyzed man who was secretly whole. A flash of betrayal flared in my chest, followed instantly by deep, agonizing confusion. Why would you hide this? I demanded, my voice cracking. Why would you let me carry you? Why would you let me watch you waste away in that chair? Jared finally turned to look at me, and the raw pain in his expression shattered my anger. Because if I stood up, she would have run, he said, his voice thick with a dark, suffocating sorrow. And she would have taken everything. He took a deep breath, leaning his head back against the seat. It did not happen all at once, he explained. About 2 years ago, I started feeling a tingling in my lower back, then a dull ache in my thighs. I was ecstatic. I wanted to scream it from the rooftops. I wanted to tell you to tell Monica. I thought the nightmare was finally over. I listened, my heart pounding against my ribs. But then the fog started, Jared continued. Right as I was making real progress, I began waking up exhausted. My muscles felt like lead. My mind was constantly swimming in a thick, heavy haze. I thought it was just depression, or maybe my body rejecting the healing process. I was sleeping 14 hours a day. I could not keep my eyes open long enough to even try moving my toes. I thought I was dying. The memory of those days hit me. I remembered Jared sleeping through the afternoons, his head slumped forward in his wheelchair, his face pale and slack. I had blamed the trauma. I had blamed the lingering grief of his accident. I started suspecting something was wrong with my medication, Jared said softly. But Monica handled all my prescriptions. She handled all my meals. One night a few months ago, the brain fog finally lifted just enough for me to wake up in the middle of the night. I was thirsty. I rolled my chair out of the bedroom and down the hall. Jared swallowed hard, his hands balling into fists on his lap. She was in the kitchen, Dad. The lights were off, but the glow from the stove illuminated her face. She had a mortar and pestle. I sat in the darkness of the hallway and watched my wife grind down heavy, unauthorized muscle relaxants and industrial-grade sedatives. I watched her scoop the white powder and stir it directly into the batch of coffee grounds we used every morning. I watched her mix it into the soup she had prepared for my lunches. A cold, paralyzing horror washed over me. The air in the car suddenly felt too thin to breathe. She was drugging me, Jared whispered. She was keeping me a chemical prisoner in my own body. Whenever my nerves started firing, whenever my muscles tried to wake up, she buried them under a mountain of sedatives. She needed me helpless. She needed me bound to that chair. The realization hit me with the force of a freight train. My mind flashed back to the countless mornings I had poured that very coffee for my son. The lunches I had warmed up and fed him spoonful by spoon. I had been her unwitting accomplice. I had been feeding my own son the poison that kept him trapped. A wave of nauseating guilt crashed over me so intense it made my vision blur. I gripped the steering wheel, my chest heaving as I gasped for air. I did not know I choked out tears of absolute shame burning my eyes. Jared, I swear to you I did not know. Jared reached across the console and placed a firm, steady hand on my shoulder. I know, Dad, he said, his voice softening for the first time. I know you did not. That is why I could not tell you. If you knew, you would have confronted her. You would have killed her. And that is exactly what she would have wanted. I stared at my son, seeing the agonizing restraint he had exercised every single day. He had sat in that chair, pretending to be a broken, paralyzed victim, swallowing poisoned food with a smile, all while plotting his survival. He had endured unspeakable torture, waiting in absolute silence. My guilt rapidly crystallized into something else entirely. A searing, white-hot rage ignited in the pit of my stomach. It burned away the exhaustion of my 73 years. It burned away the helpless, tired old man Monica thought she had left behind. I shifted the car back into drive. The trembling in my hands vanished, replaced by a cold, deadly stillness. My mind trained over 40 years of corporate auditing to find the lies hidden in the shadows locked into focus. "Where are we going?" I asked, my voice completely devoid of fear. Jared looked out the windshield, his jaw set like stone. "We are going to catch a thief." I kept my eyes on the road as I navigated the winding suburban streets, heading toward the highway. My mind was reeling, trying to piece together the shattered reality of our lives. The revelation of the poison was horrifying, but it still left a massive, gaping hole in the story. I gripped the steering wheel, glancing at my strong, capable son sitting in the passenger seat. "Jared," I asked, my voice barely above a whisper, "why endure it? Why sit in that chair for 2 whole years? The moment you realized what she was doing, you could have called the police. You could have stood up, walked out that door, and exposed her to the world. Why pretend to be paralyzed for so long?" Jared let out a long, bitter breath. He turned to face me, and the sheer calculation in his eyes mirrored the very same look I used to have during my days as a forensic auditor. "Because of the settlement, Dad," he said flatly. "The $4 million from the commercial trucking company that hit me 8 years ago." I nodded slowly. The money had been placed in a high-yield account. It was meant to cover Jared's lifelong medical care, his specialized equipment, and our living expenses. It was his safety net for the rest of his life. "She was not just playing the suffering wife for sympathy," Jared explained. "She was building a legal cage." About 18 months ago, when my head was finally clear enough to start sneaking around the house at night, I managed to crack the passcode on her home office laptop. I started digging through her files. What I found was a mountain of legal paperwork: drafts of petitions, affidavits, applications for full medical and financial conservatorship. A cold dread settled in my stomach. I knew exactly what that meant. A conservatorship would strip Jared of all his legal rights. It would reduce him to the status of a dependent child in the eyes of the law. She was laying the groundwork to prove that I was completely incompetent. Jared continued, his voice cold and steady. She had been taking detailed notes, creating a fake journal documenting my supposed cognitive decline. She claimed my memory was failing, that I was experiencing paranoid delusions, that the trauma of the accident had finally broken my mind. She was building a medical history to present to a judge. The brilliance and sheer evil of her plan left me breathless. Monica was not just a greedy spouse. She was a predator, meticulously stalking her prey. "If I had just stood up 2 years ago," Jared said, leaning closer to me to emphasize his point. "If I had called the police and told them my wife was drugging me, what do you think would have happened?" I swallowed hard, the terrible truth dawning on me. "She would have cried," Jared said, answering his own question. "She would have put on that perfect, innocent face and told the police that I was hallucinating. She would have shown them her fake journals. She would have said it was the brain injury talking. And who would the authorities believe? The saintly, devoted caregiver who sacrificed her life for her crippled husband, or the brain-damaged, paranoid man making wild accusations without a single shred of proof? I was absolutely right. The police would have handed him right back to her. And once I played my hand," Jared whispered, his voice dark with absolute certainty, "she would have known that I was onto her. She would have filed that emergency conservatorship the very next morning. They would have locked me in a psychiatric ward, and she would have had complete, undisputed access to the $4 million. She would have legally drained the accounts, wired the money overseas, and vanished long before I could convince a judge to let me out." I felt a profound mixture of horror and awe. My son had been sitting in that wheelchair, staring out the living room window, day after day, secretly playing a high-stakes game of chess for his very survival. He had swallowed the minimal amount of tainted food required to keep up appearances, secretly dumping the rest into napkins or down the drain when she turned her back. He had forced his awakening muscles to remain limp while she bathed him. He had endured absolute humiliation because it was the only way to stay alive. I had to play the long game, Dad, Jared said, staring out the window at the passing cars. I had to let her think she was winning. I had to make her feel so secure, so absolutely in control, that she would eventually get sloppy. I needed her to initiate the final financial transfer. My mind began to race, the old instincts of a corporate auditor snapping to life. I understood the mechanics of financial fraud better than anyone. White-collar criminals always operate under the illusion that they are the smartest person in the room. They build intricate webs of deception, but to move that kind of money, they must inevitably leave a paper trail. You were waiting for the wire fraud, I stated, the pieces clicking into place. Exactly, Jared replied, turning to look at me with a fierce, burning intelligence. Stealing a few $1,000s here and there is hard to prove, but moving $4 million out of a protected account requires signatures. It requires multi-factor authentication. It requires a deliberate, premeditated digital footprint. If I try to expose her before she moves the money, she walks away free. I had to wait until she initiated the final irrevocable transfer. I had to wait for her to commit an undeniable federal crime. I gripped the steering wheel tightly. The depth of my son's strategy was staggering. He had sacrificed 2 years of his life, 2 years of walking, running, and living freely, just to ensure that the woman who tried to destroy him would be utterly consumed by her own greed. And that brings us to today, Jared said softly. The atmosphere in the car shifted, the tension ratcheting up to an agonizing level. I looked at him quickly before turning my eyes back to the road. Today, Jared nodded, his expression completely hardened. The business trip is a lie. She is making her final move today, and we are going to let her walk right into the trap. I stared at the road ahead as the morning sun reflected off the windshield. My hands no longer shook against the leather steering wheel. The terrified old man who had been scrubbing floors just an hour ago was dead. In his place was a forensic auditor waking up from a long, forced retirement. I pressed my foot down on the gas pedal, causing the engine to roar to life as we merged onto the interstate. How do you know she is making the transfer today? I asked, keeping my voice perfectly level. Jared shifted in the passenger seat and rubbed the back of his neck. Last night, after you went to sleep, she gave me my evening dose of medication. I pretended to swallow the pills, but tucked them under my tongue. I waited until she turned the lights off and got into bed. It took her about an hour to finally fall into a deep sleep. I lay there in the dark, listening to the steady rhythm of her breathing. When I was absolutely sure she was out, I carefully slid out from under the covers. I listened intently, imagining my son moving through the shadows of our home, risking everything. I crept down the hallway and slipped into her home office. Jared continued. She is incredibly arrogant, Dad. She thinks she is the smartest person in any room she walks into. She leaves her work laptop on her desk every night. It took me months to figure out her passwords by watching the reflection of her fingers on the window glass when she worked in the evenings. Last night I logged in and went straight to her private email server. What did you find? I asked. There is no consulting retreat in Chicago, Jared said, his voice dripping with absolute disgust. The flight itinerary she printed out and left on the kitchen counter is a complete fabrication. She generated a fake ticket just to get you off her back. She is not going to the airport. Then where is she going? I demanded. She has an in-person appointment at 1 o'clock this afternoon, Jared explained. She is meeting with a private wealth broker at a boutique financial firm downtown. I found the drafted wire transfer authorizations in a hidden folder on her hard drive. She has been liquidating the $4 million settlement in small increments over the past 3 weeks, transferring the assets into a centralized holding account. Today, she is signing the final release forms. She is going to initiate a single massive wire transfer to move the entire $4 million into a shell company registered overseas. The sheer audacity of her plan made my blood run cold. She had meticulously orchestrated every single detail. She had created a fictional business trip to ensure she would have an uninterrupted weekend, to execute the transfer, pack her things, and vanish before the banks reopened on Monday morning. By the time I realized she was not coming back, the accounts would be drained and the money would be untraceable. "What time is it right now?" Jared asked. I glanced at the digital clock on the dashboard. "It is just past 10 in the morning," I replied. "That gives us less than 3 hours," Jared said, staring out the window at the towering skyline of the city approaching in the distance. "If she signs those papers and the broker hits send, the money disappears into a digital black hole. We will never see a single dime of it again. We have to catch her before she finalized the paperwork." A heavy silence fell over the car as the reality of our timeline set in. 3 hours. We had 3 hours to dismantle a conspiracy that had been 2 years in the making. "Are you scared?" I asked my son, glancing at his determined profile. Jared let out a sharp, humorless laugh. "I was scared every single day for the last 2 years," he said quietly. "I was scared every time she handed me a plate of food. I was scared every time I had to pretend my legs were dead flesh while she bathed me. I lived in a constant state of pure, suffocating terror. But right now, sitting in this car with you, I am not scared at all. I am just ready." His words resonated deep within my own chest. The dynamic of our entire existence had just shifted on its axis. For years, Monica had treated us like helpless prey. She had stalked us in our own home, feeding off our grief, slowly draining our life and our dignity. She thought she was leaving behind a crippled husband and a foolish old man. She thought she had already won the game. She had made the one fatal error that arrogant criminals always make. She had underestimated her victims. I gripped the steering wheel and accelerated, weaving through the morning traffic with a precision I had not used in decades. My mind was already categorizing, data-forming strategies, and anticipating the legal hurdles we were about to face. I had spent my entire professional life hunting down corporate embezzlers and unearthing hidden financial crimes. Monica was an amateur playing in a league she did not fully understand. "We are not just going to stop her," I said, my voice echoing with a cold, absolute certainty. "Stopping her just means she gets to walk away and try this again. We are going to let her walk right up to the edge of the cliff. We are going to let her think she has won. And then we are going to burn her entire world to the ground." Jared looked at me, a fierce, proud smile slowly spreading across his face. The city skyline loomed ahead of us, a concrete jungle where Monica thought she was about to pull off the perfect crime. We sped toward the downtown district, no longer two broken men trapped in a suburban nightmare. The hunted had officially become the hunters, and we were about to close the trap. The city traffic thickened around us as we entered the downtown financial district. Jared sat beside me in the passenger seat, with his eyes glued to the screen of his phone. A small blue dot blinked on the digital map and moved steadily down the grid of streets. "I linked her location services to my device a month ago," Jared explained quietly, while his eyes never left the screen. "She bought a new phone and asked me to set up the data transfer. She thought I was just a helpless guy playing with settings to pass the time. She had no idea I was building a permanent bridge to her location." I navigated the car through a busy intersection and kept my hands gripping the steering wheel. "Where is she right now?" I asked. "She just turned onto Montgomery Avenue," Jared replied. "She is slowing down, so take the next left." I turned the wheel and brought us onto a wide avenue lined with towering glass and steel skyscrapers. These were the monuments of high finance, where billions of dollars moved invisibly through the air every single day. I pulled the car to the curb and put it in park. We were sitting across the street from a massive, sleek structure with polished black marble columns. The gold lettering above the entrance read, "Vanguard Wealth Management." "There she is," Jared said as his voice dropped to a harsh whisper. I looked across the busy avenue. Monica drove her luxury sport utility vehicle up to the valet stand in front of the building. My heart hammered against my ribs. Seeing her there miles away from the airport she was supposedly rushing to made the reality of her betrayal sickeningly concrete. She stepped out of the vehicle and handed her keys to the attendant. She was not dressed for a flight or a casual business retreat. She wore a sharp charcoal designer suit and carried a thick leather briefcase. She looked incredibly confident with a practiced wave of her hand. She checked her reflection in the glass doors and adjusted her hair. She was a woman who believed she had just pulled off the perfect crime. A man walked out of the building to meet her. He was dressed in a tailored navy blue suit that practically screamed expensive. His hair was slicked back, and he wore a heavy gold watch that caught the sunlight. He smiled broadly as Monica approached. They did not shake hands like normal business associates. They leaned in close and greeted each other with the warm, familiar ease of co-conspirators. "Who is that?" I asked, with my eyes narrowed as I watched the exchange. "That is her private broker," Jared replied, while his jaw clenched so tightly I could hear his teeth grinding. I found his name in her emails. He is the one who helped her set up the offshore holding accounts. He is the architect of the transfer. I watched them converse on the sidewalk. The broker patted Monica on the arm and gestured toward the doors. She smiled and patted her leather briefcase to clearly indicate that she had the necessary paperwork with her. They turned and walked into the gleaming lobby together before disappearing behind the tinted glass. A heavy, suffocating weight settled in the car. It was one thing to hear about the crime. It was an entirely different nightmare to watch it unfold in broad daylight. She was in there right now. She was sitting in a plush leather chair in a corner office while drinking sparkling water and smiling as she signed away my son and his future. She was finalizing the transfer in person. "She is going to do it," Jared said with his voice raw from a mixture of anger and despair. "She is going to authorize the release. Once that broker pushes the money through the clearinghouse, it will be fragmented and sent across international borders." I stared at the building, while the old instincts of a corporate auditor surged through my veins. The initial shock of the betrayal evaporated and was replaced by a cold, calculating clarity. I had spent 40 years tracking men exactly like that broker. Men who hid behind expensive suits and marble lobbies while manipulating numbers and exploiting the vulnerable. They operated on arrogance. They believed their systems were impenetrable. "They are finalizing the transfer right now," I said, while keeping my eyes fixed on the entrance. "They think they are safe because they are sitting in a secure building. But money never moves without leaving a trace. Every transaction requires an origin, a destination, and a routing path." I turned to look at my son. Jared was staring at the building with his hands gripping his knees. The physical reality of losing his entire settlement was crashing down on him. "We need to stop them," Jared said, and reached for the door handle. "We need to go in there and show them I can walk. If I walk into that lobby and demand to see the manager, they will have to freeze the accounts." I reached out and grabbed his arm to stop him. "No," I commanded with a firm and unwavering voice. "If we walk in there right now, we will cause a scene. Monica will play the victim. The broker will claim ignorance. They will shred the documents and deny everything and say it was a misunderstanding. She will walk away free." Jared looked at me with his eyes wide from desperate frustration. "Then what do we do? We cannot just sit here and watch her steal $4 million. "We are not going to just watch," I replied, and reached into the back seat to grab my laptop bag. "We are going to build a cage so tight she will never be able to escape." I unzipped the heavy canvas bag resting on my lap and pulled out my laptop. It was an older model, thick and durable, but the processing power hidden inside was exactly what I needed. Monica had spent the last 2 years laughing at this computer. She called it a dinosaur. She used to walk past me at the kitchen table, roll her eyes, and ask if I was still struggling to balance my little checkbook. She always introduced me to her wealthy friends as a low-level retired accountant. It made her feel superior to reduce my life to a punchline. She thought my entire career consisted of filing tax returns for local hardware stores and managing simple suburban budgets. What she did not know was that for 40 years, I was a senior corporate forensic auditor for one of the most ruthless financial firms in the country. I did not balance checkbooks. I hunted down embezzlers. I unraveled complex international money laundering operations. I tore apart shell companies and sent arrogant, corrupt executives to federal prison. I traced the money that dangerous people fought desperately to hide. I powered on the machine and tethered it to my secure mobile hotspot. Jared watched me from the passenger seat, his eyes wide with a mixture of shock and dawning realization. The screen flared to life, casting a cold blue glow over the dark interior of the car. I cracked my knuckles, feeling the familiar hum of adrenaline course through my veins. The dull arthritis in my hands seemed to vanish entirely, replaced by the sharp muscle memory of a hunter picking up a familiar weapon. I pulled out my cell phone and dialed a number I had not called in over 3 years. It belonged to an old friend named Thomas. He was a senior county clerk and a man whose pension I had personally saved during a massive municipal fraud investigation a decade ago. He owed me a life-altering favor, and he was the kind of man who honored his debts. The line clicked, and his gruff voice answered. I did not waste time with pleasantries or small talk. I told him I needed immediate back-end access to the unredacted public financial and property registries for the county. He hesitated for only a second before reading off a secure proxy address and a temporary access code. He warned me that the code would only stay active for 20 minutes before the security grid locked us out. I told him 20 minutes was all I needed to dismantle a thief. I typed the proxy address into my browser and hit the entry key. A digital firewall prompt appeared on the screen, demanding institutional credentials. I bypassed the standard entry portal entirely. I ran a decryption script I had built years ago for penetrating stubborn corporate firewalls. The screen blinked twice, and then the county database opened like a heavy steel vault, unlocking just for me. I typed Monica's full legal name into the search bar. I cross-referenced it with her social security number and the tax identification number of her boutique consulting firm. The database began to populate immediately. Lines of code and digital records flooded the screen. I was not looking for her personal checking account. I was looking for the hidden holding accounts, the intermediate steps money launderers use to wash stolen funds before sending them overseas. The web of her deception began to materialize right in front of me. White-collar criminals always share one fatal flaw. They believe their own brilliance makes them invisible. They forget that the financial system itself is strictly designed to remember everything. She had established 3 different limited liability companies over the past 8 months. Each company was registered under a slightly different variation of her maiden name, utilizing different registered agents to mask her ownership. She had been quietly layering these accounts, building a financial staircase to move Jared's settlement without triggering federal flagging protocols. It was a textbook layering scheme, the kind of amateur operation I used to dismantle before my morning coffee. She had systematically drained the high-yield settlement account in increments just beneath the federal reporting threshold, pooling the stolen capital into a central trust. Jared leaned over the center console, staring at the cascading lines of financial data on my screen. He looked at me as if he were seeing me for the very first time. The frail, subservient old man who scrubbed his floors had vanished. I kept my eyes locked on the monitor, my fingers flying across the keyboard with a speed and precision that defied my 73 years. Monica thought she was a financial genius. She thought she had constructed an invisible digital maze that no one in our family could ever hope to navigate. She looked at me and saw nothing but a burden to be discarded. But to a forensic auditor, there is no such thing as invisible money. Every single transaction leaves a shadow. Every transfer leaves a digital fingerprint. And as I sat in the front seat of my car, staring at the glowing screen, I was illuminating every single one of hers. The threads of her financial web were firmly in my grasp, and I was preparing to rip the entire structure apart. The digital trail on my screen painted a picture of absolute greed. I had traced the $4 million from my son's settlement to a centralized holding account. That was the money Monica was preparing to wire overseas today. But my eyes caught an anomaly in the data. An auditor does not just look at what is there. An auditor looks at the empty spaces where things should be. I noticed a secondary stream of capital feeding into that same holding account. It was a massive lump sum of cash that had been deposited just 3 days ago. It was exactly $600,000. I paused. The settlement account had already been drained. This new money came from an entirely different source. I highlighted the routing number and ran a reverse trace through the county records. The server churned for a few agonizing seconds. Then the source document appeared on my screen. It was a property deed. Specifically, it was the deed to the suburban home I shared with Jared and Monica. The home I had poured my entire life savings into, securing after the accident, to make sure my son had a safe place to live. My breath caught in my throat. I clicked on the attached financial encumbrances. A digitized legal document expanded across the screen. It was a finalized reverse mortgage. Someone had borrowed against the entire equity of my house. The terms of the loan were incredibly predatory. It demanded immediate repayment upon default and carried a staggering interest rate. I scrolled down to the bottom of the electronic document to see the authorization signatures. There was Monica's elegant, sweeping handwriting, and right beside it was my own signature. I stared at my name on the glowing screen. The loops and the angles were a near-perfect match, but I had never seen this document in my life. I had never signed it. "She forged my signature," I whispered. Jared leaned closer to the screen. His breathing grew shallow and rapid. "What does that mean, Dad?" "It means she did not just steal your settlement," I replied, while a cold, numbing dread spread through my chest. "She leveraged the entire house. She took out a $600,000 loan against the property and dumped the cash into her holding account. The moment the bank realizes the mortgage payments are not being made, they will foreclose. We will be evicted. She is leaving us homeless." The sheer scale of her malice was difficult to comprehend. She was not just a thief running away with a stolen fortune. She was a predator who wanted to ensure her victims had absolutely no resources left to pursue her. She was burning our lives to the ground so she could walk away by the light of the fire. She wanted Jared trapped in his wheelchair and me out on the street. I closed the property registry and opened a new search window. If she was stealing the equity of the house, it meant she had absolutely no intention of ever returning. The fake itinerary she had left on the kitchen counter claimed she was flying to Chicago and returning on Sunday. But people who steal nearly $5 million do not buy round-trip tickets. I pulled up the Federal Aviation Database. I bypassed the standard passenger search and ran a query on her passport number. The system searched international departures for the current date. A confirmed booking appeared on the screen. "She is not going to Chicago," I said while keeping my eyes locked on the monitor. "She has a confirmed seat on a private charter flight leaving the local executive airport tonight at 11:45. It is a one-way ticket to Georgetown in the Cayman Islands." Jared stared at the screen. The reality of his wife's ultimate betrayal washed over him. She was going to kiss me goodbye this morning and fly to a tropical island tonight. She was going to leave me sitting in that wheelchair to wait for a bank to kick us out onto the street. The ticking clock in my head grew louder. It was almost 11 in the morning. Monica was currently sitting inside the Vanguard Wealth Management building across the street. She was sitting with her corrupt broker signing the final wire transfer authorizations. Once the ink dried, the broker would initiate the transfer of almost $5 million to an offshore account in the Caymans. She would spend the afternoon finalizing her travel arrangements. By midnight, she would be drinking champagne on a private jet, while Jared and I were left with absolutely nothing. "She thinks she has tied up every loose end," I told my son. "She thinks we are sitting in the living room right now, completely unaware that our entire world has been sold out from under us. She thinks she has won." Jared looked across the street at the polished black marble columns of the financial building. His hands gripped his knees. He looked ready to tear the car door open and storm into the lobby. "We cannot let her sign those papers, Dad. We have to go in there right now. We have to call the police and tell them she forged your signature on the mortgage." I reached out and placed my hand firmly over his. "We are not calling the police yet," I commanded. "Why not?" Jared demanded. "She is stealing our home. Because right now we only have a digital trail of breadcrumbs," I explained with the cold logic of an auditor. "If we send the police into that building, she will deny everything. She will claim you are a confused, disabled man, and I am a forgetful old fool. The broker will hide the paperwork and claim confidentiality. The police will tell us it is a civil matter and leave. And the moment they are gone, she will change her flight to an earlier time and vanish." Jared stared at me with desperate eyes. "Then how do we stop her?" "We do not stop her," I said while slowly closing my laptop. "We are going to let her sign those papers. We are going to let her commit federal wire fraud. We are going to let her dig a hole so deep she will never be able to climb out." I put the computer back into its canvas bag. We need to go somewhere quiet. We need to prepare a trap that she will not see until the steel jaws snap shut around her. I opened a new terminal window on my screen to trace the exact routing pathway she had established with her broker. The primary holding account was just a stepping stone. I needed to see the final destination. My fingers typed the command lines rapidly. The screen filled with international bank identifier codes. I tracked the digital sequence across the global banking network. The numbers settled on a registered entity located in Georgetown in the Cayman Islands. It was a shell company with a generic name designed to fade into the endless sea of offshore corporations. I pointed to the blinking code on the screen. "There it is," I told my son. "That is the finish line." "What does that mean?" Jared asked while his eyes scanned the complex strings of numbers. "It means she has chosen a jurisdiction that does not cooperate with our federal authorities," I explained quietly. "Once that broker hits the execute button inside that building, the $4 million will be converted into a digital pulse. It will bounce through a correspondent bank in New York and then shoot directly into that Cayman account. The second it lands, the shell company will scatter the funds across a dozen different decentralized accounts." The sheer scale of the devastation settled heavily over us. I watched the realization wash over my son. "If that wire clears," I said, "the money is completely untraceable. It vanishes like smoke in the wind. A team of federal investigators could spend 10 years looking for it, and they would never find a single cent. She will be sitting on a beach sipping cocktails, and you will be left with a wheelchair and an eviction notice." Jared stared at the black marble columns of the wealth management firm across the street. The heavy glass doors reflected the midday sun. His breathing grew shallow and erratic. The muscles in his neck tightened into thick cords. He had spent 2 years swallowing poisoned food. He had spent 2 years trapping his own body in a chair to survive. And now the woman who had tortured him was sitting just 50 yards away, casually signing her name to erase his entire existence. The injustice of it was too much for him to bear. The raw human instinct for survival took over. "I am not letting her do this," Jared said with a sudden explosive intensity. He unbuckled his seatbelt. His large hand grabbed the metal door handle. He was ready to throw his body out of the car. He was ready to march across 4 lanes of busy traffic walk, straight through those glass doors, and physically tear the pen out of her hand. He wanted to scream the truth to the entire lobby. He wanted to watch the terror flood her eyes when she saw her paralyzed husband standing tall and whole. I reached across the center console and clamped my hand down hard on his shoulder. My grip was unyielding. "Jared, look at me," I commanded with a sharp, authoritative tone. He turned his head. His eyes were wild with panic and fury. "We have to stop her, Dad," he pleaded. "If we let that wire go through, we lose everything. We have to go in there and stop the transfer right now." I squeezed his shoulder firmly to ground him in the moment. "Stopping her right now only prevents the theft," I said with absolute clarity. "It does not punish the crime." Jared froze. He looked at me with confusion battling the rage in his eyes. "If you walk through those doors and physically stop her from signing those papers, she is guilty of nothing but bad intentions," I explained. "She will cry. She will act confused. Her expensive broker will shred the wire authorization forms before the police even walk into the room. She will hire a brilliant defense attorney who will claim she was just trying to manage her disabled husband's finances. She will walk out of a courtroom completely free. I leaned closer to my son. I made sure my voice conveyed the cold, calculated reality of the situation. We cannot just stop her from taking the money, I said softly. We have to put her in a federal prison. And to do that, we need a crime. We need her to willingly and deliberately cross the point of no return. We need her signature on that wire transfer. We need the electronic timestamp of her committing major financial fraud. Jared let go of the door handle. He slumped back into the passenger seat and took a deep, trembling breath. The wild panic in his eyes slowly began to recede. It was replaced by a dark understanding. If she sends the wire, the money is gone, Jared whispered. You just said it yourself. Once it hits the Caymans, we can never get it back. I offered my son a slow, grim smile. I said the money would be untraceable if it actually reached the Caymans, I corrected him. I opened my laptop bag and pulled out my cell phone. She thinks she is playing a game with a crippled man and a retired accountant, I said, while staring across the street at the towering financial building. She does not know that I spent 40 years building the very traps she is trying to walk through. We are going to let her authorize the wire, but we are going to make sure that money never reaches the island. I unlocked my phone and brought up my contacts list. We needed to move immediately. The trap was ready to be set, but I needed a very specific kind of predator to help me spring it. I navigated the car away from the towering glass facade of Vanguard Wealth Management and pulled into the small, cracked parking lot of a 24-hour diner a few blocks away. The stark contrast between the glittering financial monuments and this worn-down establishment felt appropriate. We needed a place where no one was looking, a place where men in expensive suits did not go. I cut the engine, but neither of us moved to open our doors right away. Jared stared blankly through the windshield, his chest rising and falling with heavy, uneven breaths. He had spent 2 years locked in a silent, agonizing battle of wills against his wife, surviving, day by day, on pure adrenaline and absolute restraint. The realization that she was currently sitting in an air-conditioned office just down the street, casually erasing his entire future, was threatening to break his composure. I understand what you are feeling right now, I said, my voice quiet but steady in the cramped space of the car. You want to tear the walls down. You want to scream the truth so loudly that the whole world hears it. Jared gripped the door handle, his knuckles turning white. She is signing those papers, Dad. We are sitting here doing nothing while she steals $4 million and our house. It feels like we are just letting her win. I reached out and placed my hand firmly over his, forcing him to look at me. We are not doing nothing, I commanded, locking my eyes onto his. We are doing exactly what we need to do. I spent 40 years watching men and women just like Monica walk into federal courtrooms. The ones who walked out free were the ones who were interrupted before they finished committing the crime. Jared's expression shifted, the wild panic slowly yielding to a desperate need for answers. What do you mean? I took a slow, deep breath, pulling forward decades of hard-earned experience. The core rule of forensic auditing is very simple, I explained, keeping my tone deliberately cold and analytical. Never interrupt an enemy while they are creating a paper trail. If we march into that lobby right now, what happens? She bursts into tears. She claims she was just consolidating funds to secure better care for you. Her broker shreds the wire authorization documents the moment things get complicated. I paused, letting the reality of the situation sink in. The police arrive. They see a highly distressed, devoted wife and a husband who has miraculously recovered from paralysis. It becomes a messy domestic dispute. She walks out the front door completely free and clear. She gets to hire a divorce attorney and fights you for half the remaining settlement. Jared slumped back into the passenger seat, closing his eyes as the horrible truth of my words settled over him. She walks away, he whispered. Exactly, I said. But if we wait, if we let her sign her name on that final digital ledger, if we let her broker push the execute button and send that money into the international clearing system, she commits federal wire fraud. That is not a messy domestic dispute. That is a mandatory minimum sentence in a federal penitentiary. I watched my son absorb the information. I was asking him to do the most terrifying thing imaginable. I was asking him to gamble his entire life savings, his absolute security, on the expertise of his 73-year-old father. We got out of the car and walked into the diner. The bell above the door jingled, and the smell of stale coffee and fried food greeted us. We slid into a cracked red vinyl booth near the back corner, as far away from the windows as possible. A tired waitress dropped 2 laminated menus on the table and poured us black coffee without asking. Jared wrapped his large hands around the hot mug. He was no longer the helpless man I had hoisted into a wheelchair that morning. He was a survivor, tough and resilient, but he was operating entirely outside his element. How do we let her commit the crime without losing the money? Jared asked, his voice low and intense. If she wires it to the Cayman Islands, you said yourself that it is gone forever. How do we let her pull the trigger without the bullet hitting us? I pulled my laptop out of its canvas bag and set it on the sticky Formica table. I opened the screen and brought up the unredacted financial registry files I had pulled earlier. Because she is an amateur playing in a professional league, I replied, staring at the complex web of LLCs she had constructed. She thinks she is moving cash in a briefcase. She does not understand that international wire transfers are not instantaneous. They do not just jump from a bank in our city straight to an island in the Caribbean. They have to pass through a correspondent bank, usually in New York, where the funds are cleared and verified before leaving the country. I pointed to a specific string of routing numbers on the screen. That is the choke point. There is a window of time, usually between 2 and 4 hours, where that money is sitting in digital purgatory. It has left her account, meaning that the crime has been fully executed and recorded, but it has not yet reached the offshore shell company. Jared leaned closer to the screen, his eyes scanning the numbers he did not fully understand. So we intercept it while it is in the air. I offered a grim, tight-lipped smile. We do not just intercept it. We hijack the destination. But I cannot do it alone. I need someone who operates at a level of legal ruthlessness that I cannot match. I need a monster to fight a monster. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my cell phone. I scrolled past the family numbers, past the doctors and the pharmacies, down to a contact I had not called since my retirement party. The name on the screen was Sullivan. He was a former colleague, a shark of a corporate attorney who specialized in international asset recovery. He was abrasive, deeply cynical, and brilliant. I hit dial and put the phone to my ear. Jared watched me intently. What is he going to do? I is going to file a sealed emergency injunction directly with the clearinghouse in New York. He is going to present proof of identity theft and forgery. He will not stop the wire from leaving Monica's bank. He will simply reroute the landing coordinates. When the money hits New York, Sullivan's injunction will bounce it out of the international queue and drop it directly into an impenetrable court-ordered trust account here in the United States. The line clicked, and Sullivan's sharp, impatient voice answered. I did not bother with pleasant, Sullivan. I said, my voice echoing with the authority of the auditor I used to be. I need a sealed ex parte injunction filed in the Southern District of New York within the next 2 hours. We are intercepting a $4 million fraudulent wire transfer attempting to exit the country. There was a brief pause on the other end of the line, followed by a low, dry chuckle. Bruce Sullivan replied, his tone dripping with dark amusement. I thought you were dead or playing golf in Florida. Send me the routing numbers. Let's go hunting. I ended the call and looked across the table at my son. The terrified, paralyzed victim was gone. The old man scrubbing floors was gone. We were no longer simply trying to survive. We were building the gallows. The line remained silent for a brief moment before Sullivan spoke again. I could hear the faint sound of city traffic through the window of his Manhattan office. He did not ask how I was doing or why I had been out of touch for so long. Sullivan was a man who communicated strictly through the language of leverage and aggressive litigation. He asked me to confirm the exact sum of the transfer and the origin of the funds. I kept my voice low and steady over the ambient noise of the diner. I told him about the $4 million medical settlement and the $600,000 fraudulent reverse mortgage. I told him about the forged signatures and the illicit holding accounts. I heard the sharp rhythmic clacking of his keyboard as he typed the information directly into a secure terminal. He told me that Monica was making a classic mistake. Amateurs always assume that moving money offshore is a simple straight line. He explained that large international transfers trigger a mandatory compliance hold at the Federal Clearinghouse. They do not just fly across the ocean. They sit in a digital holding pen for a few hours while algorithms check for sanctions and terror flags. That holding pen was exactly where Sullivan was going to strike. He outlined his strategy with ruthless precision. He was not going to send a cease and desist letter to her local bank. Doing that would alert her and give her a chance to destroy her hard drive and shred the authorization forms. Instead, he was drafting an ex parte emergency injunction to file directly with a federal judge in the Southern District of New York. The judge would seal the order so no one at her local bank or the wealth management firm would see it coming. When Monica and her broker hit the execute button, the money would leave her account normally. She would receive a confirmation receipt. She would think the crime was completely successful. But the moment those funds hit the clearinghouse in New York, the federal injunction would act like a digital tripwire. The routing numbers pointing to the Cayman Islands would be overridden. Sullivan said he was establishing a blind escrow trust under the direct jurisdiction of the federal court. The almost $5 million would bounce off the clearinghouse wall and drop cleanly into that secure trust. The money would be absolutely safe and legally frozen. Monica would not receive any error messages. Her broker would not get any bounce-back alerts. They would both remain completely blind to the fact that the money had been hijacked until it was far too late. I gave Sullivan the account numbers, the routing codes, and the specific details of the shell company in Georgetown. He told me to keep my phone close and promised to call me the second the judge signed the injunction. He hung up the phone without saying goodbye. That was exactly why I liked working with him. I placed my phone face down on the sticky diner table and looked across at my son. Jared was staring at me with a profound mixture of awe and residual panic. He asked me if I was absolutely certain that this lawyer could pull it off. He asked what would happen if the judge refused to sign the order, or if the clearinghouse processed the transfer too quickly. I folded my hands together and leaned forward. I told Jared that Sullivan was not just a lawyer. He was a legal predator who thrived on tearing apart corrupt financial institutions. I assured my son that Sullivan already had a judge on speed dial who specialized in freezing illicit assets. The legal net was being woven as we spoke, and it would be completely impenetrable. I explained to Jared that we were building an invisible floor over a bottomless pit. Monica was going to step off the ledge thinking she was going to land safely on a tropical island with millions of dollars. She would not realize the floor was there until she hit it at terminal velocity. We sat in the diner, while the minutes ticked by at an agonizingly slow pace. It was a strange and terrible kind of torture to sit in a booth drinking bitter coffee while the woman who had poisoned my son was sitting in an office just down the street plotting our absolute ruin. Jared kept looking toward the front windows of the diner. His leg bounced anxiously under the table. The sheer physical restraint required to sit there and do nothing was clearly taking a heavy toll on him. I reminded him why this specific sequence of events was so crucial. If we stopped her inside the bank, she was just a desperate woman who made a clerical error. But by letting the money leave her account and enter the federal clearing system, she was crossing state lines with stolen funds. That elevated her actions from local fraud to a major federal crime. It meant she would not be dealing with local police detectives who might take pity on a crying wife. She would be dealing with federal agents who only cared about the paper trail. Jared took a slow, deep breath and nodded. He asked me what would happen to the broker who was helping her. I told him the broker was about to lose his entire career and his freedom. Sullivan was naming the broker and the entire wealth management firm as co-conspirators in the injunction. By the end of the day, their assets would be frozen and their records would be seized by federal regulators. The broker was tying his own noose right alongside her. The waitress walked by and topped off our coffee mugs. I thanked her and watched the steam rise from the black liquid. I looked at my son sitting across from me. He had survived 2 years of chemical imprisonment. He had endured absolute humiliation and physical torture to reach this exact moment. He had played his part perfectly. Now it was my turn to ensure his sacrifice was not in vain. We did not need to run into that building and physically drag her away from the desk. We just needed to sit in this diner and let her arrogance do all the work. We had placed the legal net directly beneath her. All we had to do now was wait for her to pull the trigger. My phone buzzed against the hard surface of the diner table. I looked down at the illuminated screen and read the brief message from Sullivan. The federal injunction was officially sealed, and the digital net was firmly in place beneath the New York clearinghouse. I slid the device back into my pocket, just as the heavy tinted doors of the wealth management firm swung open across the busy avenue. Monica stepped out onto the sunlit pavement. She was accompanied by the broker in the navy suit. I watched them stop near the valet stand. Monica turned to the broker and offered him a firm, triumphant handshake. She threw her head back and laughed at something he said. Her posture radiated absolute victory. She looked like a woman who had just conquered the world and secured a lifetime of luxury. She believed she had just flawlessly executed the theft of $5 million. She had no idea she was shaking hands with the man who would soon be named as her co-conspirator in a federal indictment. Jared sat across from me in the booth and watched his wife celebrate his total financial ruin. His breathing was slow and measured, but his eyes were completely hollow. We did not speak. We watched her get into her luxury vehicle and merge into the afternoon traffic driving away to enjoy what she thought was her final weekend of freedom before boarding a private jet. We left the diner a few minutes later and drove back to the quiet suburbs. The journey home was suffocating. The adrenaline of the chase was beginning to fade, replaced by the crushing psychological reality of what we had to do next. We had intercepted the money and secured the legal trap, but the performance was far from over. We had to return to the scene of the crime and reconstruct the illusion she had left behind. If Monica returned home for her final act and suspected even the slightest shift in our routine, she might panic and run before the authorities could arrive. I parked the car in the driveway, and we walked through the front door. The house was dead and quiet. The oppressive atmosphere of her control still clung to the walls. I walked into the kitchen and picked up the damp sponge I had dropped hours earlier. I knelt on the cold linoleum floor and placed the cleaning supplies exactly where they had been when she walked out the door. I smoothed out the list of condescending care instructions she had left on the island, making sure the paper sat exactly where she had dropped it. I turned around and watched my son walk slowly toward the living room. His heavy boots echoed in the silent house. He stopped in front of his wheelchair. He stared down at the padded seat and the metal footrests. I could see the profound physical revulsion washing over his face. He had tasted freedom this morning. He had stood tall and walked out the front door as a capable grown man. Now he had to willingly lock himself back into his cage. Jared unlaced his boots and kicked them aside. He sat down heavily in the chair and locked the brakes. He let his broad shoulders slump forward. He allowed his strong, capable legs to fall limp and lifeless against the rests. He turned his head and fixed his empty gaze on the front window, perfectly mirroring the broken, paralyzed shell of a man she had left behind. The psychological toll of watching my son endure. This humiliation broke my heart all over again. I was deliberately returning to a state of complete vulnerability, just to ensure her destruction was absolute. I walked into the living room and stood behind his chair. I placed my hands firmly on his shoulders, silently promising him that this was the very last time he would ever have to sit in that chair. I walked back into the kitchen and retrieved my laptop from its canvas bag. I placed it on the counter just out of sight from the main hallway. I opened the encrypted portal and brought up the financial tracking terminal. We had done everything we could. Sullivan had placed the legal net, and the documentation of her forgery was safely secured. The only thing left to do was wait for the execution command. The afternoon hours dragged by with agonizing slowness. The silence in the house was heavy and tense. Every tick of the wall clock felt like a hammer striking my nerves. I kept my eyes locked on the digital interface, watching the financial routing channels. Monica had authorized the transfer in the broker office, but banking protocols dictated that large international wires were batched and released at the close of the business day. She had to log into her secure portal and give the final digital approval to release the funds. The sun began to dip below the tree line outside the kitchen window, casting long, dark shadows across the floor. The digital clock on my screen turned to 3:58. My chest tightened. Jared remained perfectly still in the other room. He did not make a single sound. The clock shifted to 3:59. I held my breath. At exactly 4:00, the screen on my laptop blinked. A long cascading string of red data flooded the terminal window. It was the digital confirmation receipt. Monica had logged in and hit the send button. The $4 million immediately left her local holding account and plunged into the international clearing system. She had officially transmitted stolen funds across state lines. The federal servers permanently recorded her digital fingerprint, the exact timestamp, and the origin point of her device. The crime was no longer a plan or an intention. It was a fully executed federal offense recorded on government mainframes. There was absolutely no turning back. She could never claim a clerical error. She could never blame the broker. She had personally pushed the button that sealed her fate. I closed the laptop monitor and let out a long breath that I felt I had been holding for 8 years. The wire was in the air, falling straight into Sullivan's hidden trust. The trap had officially snapped shut. All we had to do now was wait for her to come home. The digital wire transfer was safely intercepted and secured on Friday afternoon, but our work was far from finished. We had the financial evidence to put her away for wire fraud, but I wanted to ensure she faced justice for the physical torture she had inflicted on my son. Early Saturday morning, before the sun even fully rose over the quiet suburban streets, I helped Jared into the passenger seat of my car for a very different kind of journey. We drove an hour out of the city to a private, independent medical facility. I had used my old corporate contacts to secure an emergency confidential appointment with a board-certified neurologist who had absolutely no ties to Monica or the network of doctors she had carefully selected over the years. The drive was quiet. Jared watched the trees blur past the window while the reality of what we were about to do settled over us. For 2 years, he had avoided doctors because Monica was always in the room answering questions for him and controlling the narrative. Today, he was finally going to speak for himself. Today, he was going to lay bare the absolute nightmare he had endured in silence. When we walked through the sliding glass doors of the clinic, the receptionist immediately offered to bring a wheelchair. Jared politely declined. He walked straight to the front desk, his steps slow but incredibly steady. I handed the receptionist a thick folder containing Jared's entire medical history from the fateful car accident. The files stated clearly and repeatedly that the man standing in front of her was completely and permanently paralyzed from the waist down. The confusion on her face was immediate, but she quickly ushered us into a private examination room without asking any unnecessary questions. A few minutes later, the neurologist walked in. He introduced himself as Dr. Aris and opened the heavy medical file. He read the first few pages and then looked up at my son, standing firmly on his own 2 feet. He asked us to explain exactly what was going on. Jared sat on the edge of the examination table and told the doctor everything. He explained the initial miraculous return of sensation 2 years ago. He described the sudden suffocating brain fog and the crushing muscle lethargy that followed right when he thought he was recovering. And finally, he explained the terrible discovery in the dark kitchen when he caught his wife tampering with his food. Dr. Aris listened in absolute silence. His professional demeanor did not waver, but I could see the profound gravity settling into his eyes. He did not ask if Jared was sure. He did not suggest it was a misunderstanding or a trick of the light. He simply put down the medical file and told us they needed to draw blood immediately. The next 2 hours were a blur of intense medical examinations. Dr. Aris tested Jared's reflexes, his muscle tone, and his nerve responses. He documented every single flinch and every display of physical strength. He noted that while Jared's muscles showed signs of severe long-term atrophy from being needlessly confined to a chair, they were fully functional and actively recovering. The paralysis was officially and medically gone. The medical record was updated and certified right then and there, proving beyond any shadow of a doubt that my son was a physically capable man. But the physical examination was only the first half of the equation. The doctor called in a specialized technician to conduct a comprehensive deep tissue toxicology screen. They took multiple vials of blood and requested a generous hair follicle sample. Dr. Aris explained that hair follicles provide a highly accurate chronological timeline of chemical exposure. If Monica had been poisoning him for 2 years, the chemical residue would be permanently trapped in the structural proteins of his hair. It was a biological ledger of her crimes that she could never erase or deny. We waited in the sterile white examination room while the laboratory processed the expedited samples. The silence between Jared and me was heavy, but it was no longer filled with despair or helpless grief. It was filled with a fierce, grim anticipation. We were forging the final, inescapable weapon we needed to destroy her completely. When Dr. Aris finally returned to the room, he was holding a stack of freshly printed lab reports. His face was pale, and his jaw was set with a tight, restrained anger. He looked at me and then looked at Jared. He told us the results were deeply disturbing. The preliminary toxicology screen revealed massive quantities of heavy central nervous system depressants. There were traces of powerful unauthorized muscle relaxants and high-grade tranquilizers circulating in his blood. Dr. Aris explained that these specific medications were heavily restricted and designed for severe psychiatric sedation or end-of-life palliative care. They were incredibly dangerous drugs that could easily cause respiratory failure or cardiac arrest if administered without strict medical supervision. I felt a cold, terrible shiver run down my spine as the reality of what she had done was scientifically confirmed. Monica had not just been making him drowsy to keep him quiet. She had been pushing his body to the absolute brink of chemical collapse every single day. She had been playing a reckless and lethal game with a cocktail of narcotics just to keep him docile and completely dependent on her care. Dr. Aris handed me the certified laboratory report. He pointed to the highlighted sections detailing the chronological accumulation of the toxins found in the hair sample. The timeline matched Jared's story perfectly. The heavy chemical markers began showing up exactly 2 years ago, right when his natural physical recovery had originally started. "This is not just medical malpractice," Dr. Aris said, with his voice dropping to a serious, fierce whisper. "This is systematic long-term poisoning. This is a severe criminal assault." He told us he was legally obligated to contact Adult Protective Services and the local authorities immediately to report the abuse. I thanked him for his integrity and his swift action. I pulled a business card from my wallet and handed it to him. It was Sullivan's direct line. I told the doctor that a massive federal injunction was already in motion and that a coordinated law enforcement arrest was currently being orchestrated. I asked him to send the certified medical reports directly to that legal team so they could be attached to the upcoming federal indictment. The doctor agreed without hesitation, assuring us that the medical evidence of her poisoning was absolutely undeniable and ready for court. We left the clinic and walked back to our car in the bright midday sun. Jared held the physical copy of the medical report tightly in his hands. He looked down at the pages documenting his torture and his miraculous survival. The paper was undeniable proof that he was not crazy. It proved that his suffering was real and that his wife was a monster who belonged behind bars. I unlocked the car doors and we got inside. The financial trap was fully locked and loaded with her federal wire fraud. Now we had the indisputable medical evidence to charge her with elder abuse, domestic poisoning, and reckless endangerment. We had built an ironclad cage around her entire life, and there was absolutely no way out. I started the engine and looked at my son. The physical and emotional exhaustion of the last 2 days was clearly visible on his face, but his eyes were clear and bright. The heavy fog of the sedatives was finally beginning to dissipate. We had everything we needed. We had the stolen money secured and the medical proof in our hands. All we had to do now was drive home and wait for Sunday evening. We were going to sit in the kitchen and wait for Monica to walk through the front door with her fake smile and her fake airplane tickets. We were going to let her tell us all about her exhausting business trip. And then we were going to end her perfect life forever. The weekend passed in a heavy, breathless silence. The house felt like a loaded gun waiting for the trigger to be pulled. We had spent Sunday morning finalizing the last details. Jared had carefully positioned his wheelchair back in the center of the living room. I had reset the kitchen precisely as Monica had left it, smoothing out the condescending list of care instructions she had tossed on the island before she walked out the door. We were ready. The digital trap was fully locked, the medical evidence was safely secured, and the federal indictment was pending. All we had to do now was wait for the architect of this nightmare to come home and step onto the stage she thought she owned. The sun was just beginning to set, casting long orange shadows across the hardwood floor, when the familiar sound of a luxury sport utility vehicle pulling into the driveway broke the silence. My heart began to pound, a steady, heavy rhythm against my ribs. I looked into the living room. Jared was sitting in his chair, his posture slumped, his legs perfectly still. He looked like the broken, defeated man she expected to find, but his eyes were locked on the front door. Burning with a cold, dark anticipation, the deadbolt clicked. The heavy oak door swung open, and Monica walked in. She was pulling her expensive leather suitcase behind her, the wheels clattering against the threshold. She was dressed in comfortable but stylish travel clothes, looking every bit the exhausted but successful corporate consultant, returning from a grueling business trip. She let out a long, dramatic sigh as she pushed the door shut with her hip and kicked off her designer shoes. She dropped her suitcase by the entryway and rolled her neck, massaging her temples with an exaggerated display of fatigue. She walked into the kitchen, entirely ignoring me, as I stood quietly by the island and headed straight for the refrigerator. She pulled out a bottle of sparkling water, twisted off the cap, and took a long drink before finally acknowledging my presence. "It was an absolute nightmare, Bruce," she said, her tone dripping with manufactured exhaustion. "I spent 14 hours a day locked in a conference room with executives who could not make a decision to save their lives. The hotel in Chicago was terrible. The room service was inedible. I barely slept. I am completely drained." I watched her perform. The sheer audacity of her lies was breathtaking. I knew exactly where she had been. I knew she had not set foot in Chicago. I knew she had spent her weekend downtown finalizing the theft of $5 million and forging my signature on a mortgage that would render me homeless. But I kept my face perfectly neutral. I let the old man mask slip comfortably into place. "I am sorry to hear that, Monica," I replied, my voice soft and subservient. She waved her hand dismissively, walking over to the counter and leaning against it. She looked past me, her eyes tracking into the living room where Jared sat motionless in his chair. She let out another heavy sigh, shaking her head as if the mere sight of her paralyzed husband was a burden she bravely bore. She did not walk over to greet him. She did not ask how his weekend had been. She just looked at him with a mixture of pity and thinly veiled disgust. "How was he?" she asked, not addressing Jared, but talking about him to me, as if he were a piece of difficult furniture. "Did you manage to follow the instructions I left? Or did you mess up his medication schedule again?" "I followed everything exactly as you wrote it," I answered quietly. Monica took another sip of her water and set the bottle down on the island. She turned her attention fully to me, and I saw the predatory calculation return to her eyes. She was preparing for her final act. She had the money. She had the exit strategy. Now she just needed to dispose of the loose ends. "You know, Bruce," she began, her voice dropping into a tone of false, gentle concern. "I had a lot of time to think on the flight home. I have been watching you lately. I see how much you are struggling." I kept my hands folded in front of me. "Struggling," I repeated softly. She nodded slowly, stepping a little closer. "Yes. You are exhausted. You are forgetting things. You messed up the bills last month and I had to fix it. Taking care of Jared is just too much for you at your age. Your mind is starting to slip, Bruce. It is not your fault. It happens to everyone when they get old." The gaslighting was masterful. She was planting the final seeds, preparing to push me out of the house she had already stolen. "I think it is time we have a serious conversation about your future," she continued, her voice practically dripping with poison, wrapped in fake empathy. "I found a wonderful assisted living facility a few towns over. They specialize in memory care. It is a locked facility, very secure, so you will not wander off and hurt yourself. I really think it is the safest place for you now. I can handle Jared on my own from here." She was trying to lock me in a psychiatric ward. She wanted me out of the way before the bank foreclosed on the reverse mortgage. It was the perfect clean ending to her perfect crime. I looked at my daughter-in-law. I looked at the woman who had poisoned my son, forged my name, and planned to destroy my entire life so she could board a private jet with a stolen fortune. I did not scream. I did not show an ounce of fear. I offered her a slow, calm smile. "You know, Monica," I said, my voice dropping the subservient tone and echoing with a sudden, sharp clarity, "I have been doing a lot of thinking this weekend, too, and you are absolutely right." Monica blinked, clearly surprised by my immediate capitulation. She had prepared for an argument. She had prepared for me to cry and beg to stay. "I am right?" she asked cautiously. I nodded, stepping forward and resting my hands flat against the cool granite of the kitchen island. "I am right. It is definitely time for a major change. This situation simply cannot continue the way it has been." Her tense posture relaxed slightly. A triumphant, victorious smile began to spread across her face. She thought she had won. She thought the tired old man was finally giving up the fight. "I am so glad you are finally being reasonable, Bruce," she said, reaching out to pat my hand patronizingly. "It will be an adjustment, but it is truly for the best." I pulled my hand back slowly, keeping my eyes locked dead on hers. The polite smile vanished from my face, replaced by the cold, hard stare of a forensic auditor who had just cornered his prey. "Oh, it is going to be a massive adjustment, Monica," I said softly. "But I am not the one who needs to worry about finding a new place to live." I reached beneath the edge of the kitchen counter, and my fingers found the heavy manila folder I had placed there an hour ago. I pulled it out and dropped it flat onto the polished granite of the kitchen island. I pushed it slowly across the smooth stone surface. It made a soft scraping sound before coming to a stop right next to her half-empty bottle of sparkling water. Monica looked down at the folder. Her perfectly arched eyebrows drew together in a knot of genuine confusion. "What is this, Bruce?" she asked with a tight, nervous chuckle. "Are these more medical bills you forgot to pay while I was gone?" I did not answer. I simply kept my eyes locked on hers and waited. She set her water bottle down and reached for the manila cover. She flipped it open with a dramatic, exaggerated sigh that was meant to show her absolute impatience with my supposed antics. The very first document on top of the stack was printed on heavy, crisp paper, bearing the distinct black and gold letterhead of Vanguard Wealth Management. It was the complete unredacted log of the digital wire transfer she had authorized just 2 days ago. Right below it lay the printed internal email communications between her and her private broker, detailing the exact routing sequence to the shell company in the Cayman Islands. I watched her eyes dart back and forth across the page. The color rapidly began to drain from her face, leaving her skin a pale, sickly white. Her perfectly manicured fingers began to tremble against the edge of the paper. She quickly flipped to the next page, trying to find something, anything that made sense in her fractured reality. The second document was a high-resolution copy of the reverse mortgage she had taken out on my house. I had used a bright yellow marker to highlight my own forged signature at the very bottom of the page. The silence in the kitchen became absolute. The only sound was the rapid, shallow intake of her breath as her mind raced to comprehend how I had obtained highly classified offshore banking files. But Monica was a professional liar. She had spent years perfecting the art of psychological deception, and she was not going to surrender without a fight. I watched her swallow hard and force her facial muscles to relax. She closed the folder and pushed it back toward me with a dismissive wave of her hand. "Bruce, you really have me worried now," she said, while forcing a shaky, condescending smile onto her lips. "You are going through my private office files and printing out complex financial documents you clearly do not understand. This is exactly why we need to get you into a memory care facility immediately. You are confused, Bruce. Your mind is playing tricks on you and making you paranoid." "I am confused," I repeated softly, while leaning my weight against the counter. She nodded quickly, leaning heavily into her fabricated narrative. "Yes, Bruce, you are highly confused. These are just standard consolidation transfers. I am moving Jared's settlement into a higher yield trust to secure better long-term medical care for him. The offshore routing is just a standard tax shelter used by wealth managers, and the mortgage was just a necessary equity release to cover the upcoming property taxes and medical retrofits for the house. You probably signed that document months ago and just forgot about it. It is perfectly normal at your age to forget these things." I let out a low, humorless laugh. It was a cold, dry sound that seemed to echo off the kitchen walls. "It is a brilliant story, Monica," I said, while looking at her with absolute disgust. "It really is. It is the exact story you planned to tell the local police when they came knocking. It is the story you thought would keep you out of a federal penitentiary when you boarded your one-way flight tonight." She opened her mouth to interrupt, but I raised my hand to stop her. "But you are forgetting one very important detail," I continued. "You always assumed I was just a foolish old man who balanced checkbooks for a living.